I'm going to begin introducing our archaeological panel today. As was mentioned during lunch, this has become national news after the press release went out from NRG about 3 days ago. At least some newspapers picked up on it, most notably the Dallas Morning News, and I must say a really smart reporter who deserves some credit, Elizabeth Souder, S-O-U-D-E-R, who spent a lot of time interviewing people and getting the story straight, and she's the energy reporter for the business section of the Dallas Morning News, but she's also a native Texan and a history buff, and she really took a very great personal interest in this story, and I think she's one of those really good reporters who does a great job and takes her work seriously. And I think all of us are in her debt who are up here on the stage today, because she's helped to get this story into the national news. It was picked up by the AP, and I think more media may pick it up as time goes by. I have a personal relationship with some of the people on this team. Greg Dimick and I go back further than either one of us would like to admit. Back before he taught himself Spanish, back before he wrote all those books, back when he was just beginning to be serious about some of this stuff, and Manuel Hinojosa too. I remember one time in particular when the History Channel decided to come along. I think this is actually what saved Greg's marriage, because Debbie was getting really ticked off about him spending not only, seeing 40 kids a week, or no, it's 40 a day, or something like that in his pediatrician's office, but spending every spare moment in the muck. She was beginning to kind of doubt his commitment there for a while as he was going out into the mud every single day. And just as she was about to give up on him, along comes the History Channel and makes him a TV star. And his local Whartonites began to think, well, maybe he's not crazy after all. And so with Manuel and me and several others along, Terry Keeler, I think, is here today. We went out with the History Channel and did a little 10-minute This Week in History. And the thing I remember most about that, because it was a very blustery December day, is actually watching a barbecue sandwich fly through the air at lunchtime. Well, let's get serious now that people are making their way in. I'm just going to introduce each member of the team in order as they come up, rather than go through the whole list. Doug Mangum is going to be the first one to speak. I'm very pleased to see that he's working on his PhD in cultural history, looking at social networks and American expansionism in the Old Southwest. Anyone who begins to dig into American expansionism in the Old Southwest begins to understand just how important these personal networks are. It's a small world in the 18 teens and 20s and 30s. And sometimes, like today, who you know is just as important as what you know. And I hope to read that before long. Right now, Doug, as is befitting someone of his... Douglas, I beg your pardon. I'm a lot closer to Greg and Manuel than I am to some of these other people. Douglas, as is befitting of someone of his age, that is a lot younger than me, is into computer work, and you're going to see some of the results of that. He maintains the computer mapping database for this entire project. He works for Roger Moore's outfit. If you haven't seen Roger Moore on TV lately, you've really missed something. If you haven't seen Jan DeVault on TV lately, you've really missed something. On Channel 13 the other night at 6:30. Douglas has participated in a number of archaeological projects. Is this your favorite one so far? Yeah, he had to say that. It is. And so with a great deal of enthusiasm, Douglas Mangum is going to tell you what he's been up to out at San Jacinto.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jim. I appreciate it. Good afternoon. I'm
As close to the mic as possible, they've asked me to say.
I'm going to be covering a lot of ground in a relatively short amount of time, so I guess just hold on. I'm going to do a brief review of earlier projects that we've done out at San Jacinto, and then I'll discuss the reasons and the methods behind the current work that we're doing out at the NRG property. For the last 6 years, More Archaeological Consulting has been working with Texas Parks and Wildlife, the Friends of San Jacinto Battleground, the Texas Archaeological Stewards Network, and a large number of volunteers who I can't say enough about, to conduct archaeological investigations in and around the San Jacinto battlefield. Initially, the work involved examining soil within the park and traditional locations of the Mexican camp to see if there were battle-related artifacts still in the park. We began work in 2003 with an examination of the depth of fill within the park. We utilized augers and backhoe trenches to do this work. We checked the soils with metal detectors as we went along on the off chance that a small excavation unit, relatively small excavation unit like an auger or a trench, would happen to stumble upon an artifact. A total of 76 augers and 35 trenches were dug during this period. And you can see on the upper left is a map of the location of these trenches and these augers. Because of this work, we were able to determine that some of the locations within the park have artificial fill soils overlying the natural soils. And it helps us to know this because if there's a certain level of fill, then often the metal detectors simply can't reach the natural soils to detect them. With this information, we were able to develop a map with the depths of these soils. You see that in the lower right, sort of a reverse topo map showing the depths of those fills and the locations. It's not complete, but it was as much as we could do. We also recovered one button, just by chance, that may or may not have been battle-related. It's probably period, but determining whether it's battle-related, we just couldn't really do. The next step was to conduct a metal detecting survey of the Mexican camp area to see if battle-related artifacts remain there. Work on this step began in 2004, and immediately we recovered a surprising number of battle-related artifacts. We used methodology that had been developed by previous battlefield archaeologists, right back to progenitor Doug Scott, who, as you know, couldn't make it today. Also, we made sure that our methodology fulfilled the requirements of Texas Parks and Wildlife and the Texas Historical Commission. One of the most important factors in this work and in all of the archaeological work out at the San Jacinto battlefield was the use of a total station and a geographic information system software to record the location of artifacts with a high degree of precision and accuracy. This allows us to look for patterns within the distribution of artifacts in hopes of seeing troop movement or other conflict indicators. And you see here a result of this work. And here are just a series of images of some of the artifacts recovered from the Mexican camp. Most of these have been displayed before, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. There are a rough total of 250 battle-related artifacts, as well as a number that we're less sure of, may or may not be battlefield related. In the upper middle is a group of musket balls, and that really was the main item that we have found. Makes up the vast bulk of the battle-related artifacts. However, we've also found gun and uniform parts, personal items, and artillery shot fragments, which, going back a bit, here you see 2 canister bases from a type of shot used in cannons to basically turn them into a shotgun. Here you see an example of the importance of documenting the artifact locations within a GIS system. An examination by Doug Scott was able to determine which of the musket balls had been fired and which had been dropped, and we were then able to display these within the GIS system over various maps to look for patterns. And as you can see, the red balls are the ones that were dropped, and the blue are ones that were fired. And you can see that there was a very small number of fired versus dropped. And so the real question is, what does all this mean? What did all of it mean to us as archaeologists and historians? First, we determined that there were indeed numerous artifacts still on the battlefield, and this in spite of the fact that some of the areas had clearly been impacted by prior construction and also by undocumented collecting. Second, we determined that it's likely that we've yet to find the precise area of the main conflict of the battle. Simply put, there were too few fired balls to suggest that we were right where the main conflict occurred. Third, we determined based on these canister bases, they are a type that was not used by the Mexican Army at this time, so they had to be American, and from the radius, we were able to determine that the Twin Sisters were 6-pounder cannons. And also because we were able to plot these locations so accurately, and we know within a certain range how far such a canister base would travel after being fired, we know that these are within 150 yards or so of where the Twin Sisters, at least one of them, actually fired from. Finally, we determined that more needs to be done. It looks like a fairly large area of coverage, but in fact there's still a lot of gaps in the coverage. The success of this initial work led to further investigations, including the next step of looking for the retreat of the Mexican Army along the edge of Peggy Lake. And this is a map of the location. Investigations at Peggy Lake began in 2005, and after 5 days of field work and a lot of days of hand clearing of the property so that we could do that work, we had found all of 27 battle-related artifacts. By comparison, as I said, we found 250 in the Mexican camp area. And the problem is not even all of these are we certain are battle-related. So many of them were musket balls, and this same location was also the location of 3 19th century homesteads. And simply put, musket balls are musket balls. It could just as easily be a local hunter. But we did have at least two items, 2 cartridge box buckles that are identical to ones that we had been finding in the Mexican camp area. And so we know from that we have a tie-in. And so what did this mean? This confirmed the presence of at least some Mexican soldiers retreating along the edge of Peggy Lake, as the accounts suggest. However, it also suggested that there were not many of them, or that they were not dropping many things at this point, or that they simply didn't have much to drop by this point. Other recent investigations that we have been directly or indirectly involved in include an electromagnetic and ground-penetrating radar survey and associated ground truthing within the Texan camp area. We also conducted a day of investigations within the Texan camp area. Dr. Everett, who is a geology professor at Texas A&M, conducted an investigation of the Mexican camp area using a machine called the EM63, which is a much more complicated form of electromagnetic survey. And we ground truth that also. We spent a single day doing a rather fast and dirty reconnaissance of some of the prairie areas south and southeast of the Mexican camp area. And finally, Dr. Everett conducted some additional work with the M63 machine south of the Mexican camp area. And A&M doctoral student Dana Peterman is currently conducting some excavations to ground truth his results there. The total results from all of these more recent investigations relatively limited. There were only 2 battle-related artifacts that came out of the Prairie reconnaissance, only a handful out of the Texas camp work, and nothing as yet from the most recent EM63 work. These finds suggest several things, that there are still artifacts in the Texan camp, and that these may include some items from the Mexican prisoners, because we did have an additional Mexican coin and a stirrup that was at least suggestive of being of Spanish or Mexican origin. And it also suggested there was an item or two found as a result of the initial EM63 work that suggested that the main conflict might be further west than we've been looking so far. It also suggested that the conflict does not appear to have been intensive to the south in this area, because we found very little at all. If there was anything, we either missed it, which is possible because we were going fast, or it's too deep. And finally, the EM63 work, here you actually see Dr. Everett trailing his EM63 machine across the surface. We were able to determine that the EM63 kind of has a hard time finding small items. It's very good at finding large items, but we actually tested it against a musket ball in the ground and just couldn't find anything. However, all of this work is still preliminary. So at this point, I want to mention, as Jeff did during the lunch, the importance of old maps and old aerial photographs to our investigation. We've learned a lot from these sources. For instance, the Yoakum map that Jeff mentioned from 1856, we discovered that it is actually quite accurate. And we've been able to put that in tandem with this 1930 Tobin aerial photograph to get a better understanding of what the landscape and the tree lines and such of the battlefield probably looked like in 1836 at the time of the battle. We've also been able to use this 1913 Corps of Engineers map, which they spent months putting together and surveying. It's really the earliest accurate topographical map of the battlefield. So our examination of these maps helps us to better understand what has happened in the battlefield since the battle, what occurred that has impacted it in one way or another, including we were able to develop this map. It's unfortunately very hard to see on this screen, but this shows us areas that have been impacted by construction since the battle, and has given us, we've been able to use this map to give us a better idea of where to dig and where to avoid digging. And the Yoakum map has also given us a suggestion of where the battle activity may have occurred. So finally, moving on to the current work. This is a map of the general area of the NRG tract. You can see it's a considerable distance from the main battlefield. So you might ask, why did we go there? Unfortunately, Jeff already answered my rhetorical question during lunch, but we had some good advice that there were items out there, in spite of the fact that it's so far from the main park, in spite of the fact that our work at Peggy Lake had so few results. We decided, okay, well, let's go ahead and do it. And though the work began in 2008, it's actually late 2007, early 2008. It's important to note that it happened because of a lot of work that went on before that, and that included the Friends of the San Jacinto Battlefield applying for an American Battlefield Protection Program grant and getting it, thankfully, and also because of the cooperation of NRG. Which literally we could not have done this without their cooperation, but they have gone above and beyond the call in that cooperation to help us do this work. This is the tract over an older older topographic map, and this is the project area over that same 1930 Tobin aerial photograph. And this actually turns out to be quite important later on in our understanding of the battlefield. This is a close-up with a pretty recent, I think it's a 2003 or 2004 aerial photograph. And as you can see, it's a pretty heavily overgrown area, not to mention it's also 50 or 51 acres in size. And we quickly realized that there's simply no way for us to go and dig the whole thing. So we determined to use a sampling methodology, and that was to cut a series of 5 lanes through the woods and sample, just check where we could, what we could get to with the amount of money that we had. To do this, we used a rather impressive machine called a wood gator. Seeing it in action, I'd hoped to embed some video on this, but I was unable to get the technology together. This machine is our new best friend in areas like this. It is able to cut trees up to 5 inches in diameter, and yet cut down to the ground without impacting the ground itself, and just makes the work that we do ever so much easier. Once that was done, we kind of went into regular archaeology mode. Teams made up of archaeologists, archaeological stewards, and metal detectorists worked together to find a potential hit. Once a hit is found, they dig together with a combination of shovels and smaller hand tools. And then if whatever the hit was turns out to be battle-related or potentially battle-related, it is recorded in detail, and we shoot it in with the total station. And usually at the end of the day, we download that and make sure everything came out right. After we surveyed the 5 lanes, this is what we found. It's, again, a little hard on this image, but what we ended up with was 2 clusters of artifacts in lane 2 and lane 3. We think that there might have been stuff in lane, at this point we were thinking that there might be stuff in lane 1 that we missed because of the proximity to very high tension power lines, which affect the ability of the metal detectors to do what they need to do. This is a better map, but pretty early on, we began to suspect that rather than simply being 2 clusters, that these might be 2 representatives of a larger artifact assemblage. And so we did some hand clearing in areas that weren't terribly overgrown and conducted some more excavations and added, I'll kind of go back and forth so that you can see, added a considerable number more artifacts, which strengthened our belief that we were talking about a formation of artifacts rather than just 2 clusters. And that led us to the decision to go ahead and cut something we called a zipper, which was a sampling lane which went back and forth across and beside. This served the dual effect of helping us fill in some of the gaps and also making sure that the linearity of artifacts didn't actually expand to the north or to the south. And this is what we found. Again, I'll go back and forth. And at this point, you can see we've pretty much filled in most of the gaps in what we now knew was a line of artifacts. It's roughly 180 meters, or I guess that's about 190 yards long, by about 20 meters, 22 yards wide. Oops, sorry. And based on that work, we decided it would be a good idea to go in and try and clear as much of it as possible. And so we proposed to dig what we call the swath, where we use the wood gator to simply cut open the whole area as much as we felt that we could. And here are some of the results. Here are some of the things that we have found. I'm not going to go into much detail about these because my co-presenters will be dealing with the artifacts more directly, but I will say that we found, during this stage, we found 443 clearly battle-related artifacts, and a lot less trash than we usually do when we've been working in the main park. There were a lot of personal items, but also many more uniform items, many more gun elements, such as initially 5 more bayonets, and most excitingly to us, it doesn't look like much, but this lower right item, once we got it back to the lab and looked at it, we realized that there was actually small swatches of cloth embedded within or attached to small bits of copper. And apparently the copper, as it sits in the soil and gets wet, it actually generates chemical properties that preserve the cloth. And so what we're looking at is small swatches of Mexican uniforms. And we haven't gotten to do much with them yet. We've only recently got them back from conservation. We're hoping to find somebody who has the expertise to look at them and tell us more about what it's made of and maybe where it was made and what methodology was used. So more recently, just at the beginning of this year, we went ahead and cut the swath that we had proposed last year and went out and did some more excavations. And you can see we expanded and filled in the line of artifacts quite a bit. And we spent 4 days doing this. Again, the bulk of the artifacts was made up of musket balls, but other artifacts were recovered, many of which we simply haven't had time yet to recover. There are a few of the conserved ones and some of the as yet unconserved ones in our display case in front, which hopefully you guys will have plenty of time to take a look at later. But perhaps one of the most important things that we realized when we started looking at the layout of the artifacts against some of the older maps, we went back and looked at the 1930 aerial photograph, and we realized that the alignment of artifacts follows the old tree line, of the natural tree line of a large motte of trees that's been growing there for who knows how many centuries. If you go back, you can see now the whole area is covered by Chinese tallow, which will pretty much grow anywhere. But in the natural state, this is what it looked like. And the artifacts align right along the edge of the tree line. And I'm going to leave it to Roger to discuss more detail about what we think that means. Now, before I close, I would like to extend our appreciation to the many, many volunteers and not so much volunteers to NRG, to too many people to name. So rather than try and name them all in the time I have, I'm just going to say thank you. Thank you very much. Finally, I want to note that the work of understanding the archaeology of the battlefield or even this particular site is far from complete. There are ongoing investigations of the artifacts we've recovered, and we will be spending more time on the battlefield in the months and years to come, at least we hope. As usual with archaeology and historical investigations, the story is simply still being written. Thank you.
Thank you, Douglas. As Director of Cultural Resources for the Texas Department of Parks and Wildlife, Michael Strutt has about 2 million problems. That's how many acres he's having to oversee. He's responsible for the historic preservation and archaeological issues in all public lands that are administered by Texas Parks and Wildlife. And he honed his skills in his native Virginia, where he was involved, as you may know, with such sites as Mount Vernon, Monticello, and the what I call Bull Run, but some people call Manassas battlefield. I'm sorry?
For us Southerners.
For the Southerners, that's right. Michael is going to be answering questions and participating in the panel. He is also going to be delivering the talk that was originally produced by another Douglas D. Scott, who's now at the Department of Anthropology at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, who, because of a family emergency, could not be with us today. But many of you may have already seen Douglas Scott, as I have, if you've watched the Discovery Channel. One of the most impressive pieces of historical detective work that I've ever seen is the piece that the Discovery Channel did on the work of Douglas Scott and others on the Battle of the Little Bighorn site, doing forensic battlefield analysis. As Michael told me last night, you can consider Douglas Scott really one of the fathers of battleground archaeology, or as Roger Moore calls it, conflict archaeology. I actually consider the mark on the door of our old apartment in New Haven, where Lynn went after me with the broom handle, as one of those sites of conflict archaeology, but I don't know if I'd consider that battleground archaeology. Lynn just yelled at me. Nevertheless, the kind of things that Douglas Scott was doing, managing to track single soldiers across the Battle of the Little Bighorn by the microscopic marks that their firing mechanism made on their cartridges, and through doing that reconstruct what was happening at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, is just extraordinary. Showing, among other things, that the Indians had better repeating rifles than the soldiers who were there, who may have had good long-distance accurate weapons, but when it comes to close combat, having to reload every time is a definite disadvantage. And if you haven't seen that Discovery Channel piece, I really recommend it to you. For a lot of his, for this and other work, Douglas Scott received the Distinguished Service Award from the Department of Interior, and from which he retired in the last 3 or 4 years, now at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. So please welcome in absentia Douglas Scott, and welcome in person Michael Strutt of the Texas Department of Parks and Wildlife, who will present Mr. Scott's work. Thank you.
Last night's reception, the key word was synchronicity, and for me, bit of synchronicity is this work at San Jacinto. As Jim said, I worked at Manassas. Early in my career, I was working for the National Park Service in 85, 86, and we did battlefield archaeology based directly upon the work that Doug and Richard Fox had done at the Battle of Little Bighorn. We might have been maybe the second NPS project to do that kind of work, and it falls exactly on the pattern that Doug put together. And for all of us up here, this project is both an honor to be working on, but it is really a direct outgrowth of Doug's work. So for me, I have sort of a personal synchronicity there. And I must make an apology since Doug could not be here today. I got his paper just yesterday, and so unfortunately I'm going to have to read it to you as opposed to being able to speak as the other speakers have done. Doug says, "I regret that I am unable to join you today in person. Until the last weekend, my plans were to be at the conference, but unexpected family issues have arisen that must take precedent. I would like to thank and acknowledge Roger Moore and Douglas Mangum and all of us here for the support of my analysis of the lead artifact assemblages from San Jacinto. I also wish to thank our hosts, which is the Friends Group, who are hosting today's events, for the invitation to participate in this symposium, and again extend my regrets for not being here. And everyone on the stage wishes Doug and his daughter especially well and a speedy recovery." So what is a musket ball? A musket ball is a small lead sphere designed to be fired from a musket, a pistol, or a rifle at a specific target with deadly force. Musket balls are manufactured by pouring molten lead or another alloy into a two-part single or multiple cavity mold. After the lead cools, the mold is separated and the musket ball removed. In a well-formed bullet, the casting sprue is cut close to the ball and any flashing around the mold seam is removed. Usually the musket ball would be put into a paper cartridge with a pre-measured charge of black powder. 19th century molds were mostly made of iron or brass, but crude molds made of soapstone and brownstone are known. The San Jacinto battleground bullets and lead artifacts are truly an interesting group of material culture. The basic conclusions that can be reasonably drawn from the data set are that several calibers of ammunition are present in the assemblage, with the vast majority being 69 to 75 caliber smoothbore musket sizes. And if you've looked at the ammunition in this case, you know that a hunk of lead coming at high velocity at you definitely has deadly force. This graph plots the distribution of large caliber musket balls by diameter and clearly shows there are two separate sizes that will fit the 69 caliber or 75 caliber muskets. Other bullet calibers noted in the analysis include the 56 caliber carbine or pistol, the 58 caliber carbine or pistol, the 44 caliber pistol or medium caliber rifle, and 50 caliber rifle round, and the buckshot. Buckshot may represent either buck and ball rounds, which is most likely. Buck and ball is a casing with a single musket ball surrounded by a cluster of smaller buckshot. Truly deadly force there. Or possibly that might have been shotgun ammunition. Several of the fired spherical balls retained evidence of being loaded with a button-headed, being a convex surface ramrod, which is typical of muskets of the period. The type is too generic, though, to determine specific origin or weapon type. The number of poorly formed or cast balls, including poorly trimmed sprues and casting flaws evident in the spherical ball assemblage, suggests that quality control was at best poor and nearly non-existent. Poorly formed bullets do not fly true nor accurate, even in smoothbore muskets. And this may account for some of the problems encountered by the Mexican Army when they were surprised by the Texas forces. One of the more interesting aspects of the analysis was the determination of unique and individual characteristics on a number of unfired spherical balls that matched other specimens, allowing the identification of at least 5 separate and individual bullet molds. In addition, many of the balls exhibited faceting on their circumference, indicating that they were jostled about in their boxes or bags or trousers or other containers before they're being deposited at the site. This indicates many bullets were manufactured off-site and brought to the site where they were lost during the short fight. However, there are also indications in the artifact assemblage that some were actively engaged in casting bullets in the camps at San Jacinto. Cut lead bar or ingots, some partially melted, as well as deformed lead balls deposited while still in a partially molten state, indicate that casting activities were being carried out on the site. Many of the cut bar lead pieces were of a size and weight consistent with the amount of lead needed to cast a single large caliber ball, like that seen in the slide. Whether this activity was concentrated in one area or a task soldiers carried out at the squad level can only be determined by the distribution of the bar lead and malformed balls across the site. Another interesting aspect of the analysis was the determination that only 20 of the 493 bullets examined, and this is not a full accounting of all of the ammunition that's been found so far. Much of that is still in conservation at A&M. 20 of those 493 were actually fired. Lead bullets, regardless of type, deform upon hitting their target based primarily on their velocity or speed at the time of impact. This slide clearly illustrates the type of deformation that occurs to bullets at various known velocities. The type and mass of the target hit can also feature in the bullet deformation process. And as you can see here quite clearly, at the different speeds, bullets will deform quite a bit. One of the fired musket balls struck at a low to medium velocity, but it struck with enough force to embed some sand grains in the body of the bullet. Another fired ball that also struck at a low to medium velocity appears to have bone fragments embedded in the body of the bullet, suggesting it struck a human or possibly an animal target. There are 2 other balls with bone embedded in the lead. This particular musket ball struck an object at high velocity, causing the bullet to split open. The striations visible on the interior surface are consistent with the bullet striking a metal surface, and the pronounced V shape to the bullet suggests the object may have hit the blade of a bayonet or another similar pointed item. And that area is right here where it may have hit something metallic and pointed. A single-fired, approximately 50 caliber ball is intriguing in a number of ways. The bullet was fired in a rifled gun, as evidenced by the Landon grooves on the rifling imprinted on the lead ball when it was fired. The bullet struck at a low to medium velocity. What makes the bullet interesting is that the width and depth of the rifling present on the bullet is consistent with the rifling found in early American hunting rifles, like the famed Hawken, Dimick, or Derringer rifles. One of the issues with the San Jacinto bullet assemblage was the question of which Army fired or dropped the rounds recovered during the archaeological investigations. One of the methods for determining sources is the analysis of the lead used in the casting of the musket ball. The chemical compositional analysis and the determination of lead sources by identifying lead isotope ratios present in a lead sample from a bullet can aid in this analysis. Lead isotopes are essentially fingerprints of the lead used in casting the bullet and are unique to the geological area from which they derive. In other words, it is possible to identify whether a specific bullet is from a Mexican mine, a British mine, or a mine in the United States or elsewhere in the world. This type of analysis requires a small sample that is destroyed in an induced coupled plasma mass spectrometer. Dr. Michael Ketterer of the University of Northern Arizona at Flagstaff conducted the lead isotope ratio analysis for us. High precision measurements of the lead isotope ratios were completed for 24 samples of lead obtained from the San Jacinto battleground. The results indicate a distinct pattern of clustering of the samples into 3 groups, referred to as the non-radiogenic group, a radiogenic group, and an intermediate group. The non-radiogenic group either exhibits isotope compositions consistent with several of the major lead mining districts in Mexico, specifically the mines at Taxico, Zacatecas, Santa Eulalia, Durango, and Tascatito. The radiogenic group, on the other hand, is consistent with the known highly radiogenic isotope compositions found in the Mississippi Valley area of the United States. The latter region consists of mines in Illinois, Wisconsin, Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, and Oklahoma, although not all of those locations were likely to have been producing lead in the 1830s. A reasonable explanation that is consistent with these results is that the non-radiogenic group consists of 11 lead projectiles of Mexican origin, and the radiogenic group consists of 12 projectiles whose sources originated in the U.S., specifically in the Mississippi Valley region. The single intermediate sample may come from a different mining location, or more likely it may represent a mixing of different leads of different origins. Several possibilities exist for the mixed lead, one that is either the Texas or Mexican troops mixed lead from different sources while making musket balls, although certainly other scenarios cannot be ruled out. In conclusion, the San Jacinto battleground bullets and lead artifacts are a truly interesting group of material culture. The basic conclusions that can be reasonably drawn from the data set are that several calibers of ammunition are present in the assemblage: the 69, 75, 56 caliber carbine, 58 carbine or pistol, the 50 caliber American hunting rifle, 44 caliber pistol or medium caliber rifle, and the buckshot may represent either buck and ball rounds or possibly shotgun ammunition. Several of the fired spherical balls retained evidence of being loaded with the button-headed convex surface ramrod, which is typical of muskets of the period although again, the type is too generic to determine origin or of the exact weapon this was used in. 3 fired balls appear to have bone fragments embedded in the body of the bullets, suggesting they struck their target. One of the more interesting aspects of the analysis was the determination of unique and individual characteristics on a number of unfired spherical balls that matched other specimens, allowing the identification of at least 5 separate and individual bullet molds. In addition, many of the balls exhibited faceting on their circumferences, indicating that they were jostled about before being deposited at the site. This indicates many bullets were manufactured off-site and then brought to the site, where they were lost during this short fight. However, there are also indications in the artifact assemblage that some soldiers were actively engaged in casting bullets while in camp at San Jacinto. The cut bar lead or ingots, some partially melted, as well as deformed lead balls deposited while in a still partially molten state, indicate that casting activities were being carried out on site. The number of poorly formed or cast balls as well as poorly trimmed sprues evident in the spherical ball assemblage suggests that quality control was at best poor and nearly non-existent. If these represent bullets lost during the battle by the Mexican Army, and if the casting procedure was spread among the men, an evening task performed around the campfire, casting balls and or rolling cartridges, then the quality control was alarmingly poor and may account in some way for the defeat of the Mexican forces. Poorly formed bullets do not fly true nor accurately, and this may account for some of the problems when they were surprised by the Texas forces. Thank you. As a final comment, I'd like to say as the Director of Cultural Resources for Parks and Wildlife, it is my job to make sure that all of our projects follow a high level of standards and consistency across everything that we do, whether I'm talking about here at San Jacinto or out in Far West or up in the Panhandle. And one of the things that you're going to be seeing today is a high level of sophistication that we are following, all of which stems directly from the work of Doug back in the 1980s and the forensic type of investigations that he does. We're following that scientific process, and it's something that I've insisted that we do at every level with whatever funding we've got. I try to find the funding to make sure that we do this so that we get the best information possible at this point in time, so that our interpretation of the battle as we continue to move forward gets better and better, because this is, as we've been talking about today, for me, being an incomer, this is the most important historic site, with all apologies to Dr. Brands, this is the most important historic site to me in Texas. So doing this level of analysis, taking this kind of time, being this particularistic, is critical in our ability to interpret the events. Even though they're well written about, there are many books written about it, the archaeology is able to add details that are not necessarily seen in the documents. Thank you.
Our next speaker is the only real doctor up here. And Greg Dimmick is also, I think, the most persistent man I know. He will simply not settle for half answers to a problem. And the problem that he ran into, I guess more than a decade ago in Wharton County was, what's this business about some kind of Spanish army camp here, or Civil War camp, or other kinds of baloney that people were feeding them to explain what might have turned up from time to time. And Greg is a master of what the 19th century philosophers called the consilience of induction, or what we might try to call the convergence of evidence, of getting all kinds of evidence in different languages of different kinds, forensic evidence, memoirs, maps, archaeological digs, you name it, and putting together the most complete story, and also figuring out who's lying, because that's what historians have to do. You know, we make a profession out of reading dead people's mail, and anyone who's ever been to college and wrote back to his mom knows that people lie sometimes, even when they're writing personal letters. So Greg has been getting deeper and deeper and deeper into what I unfortunately tried to answer 8 years ago at the very first San Jacinto Symposium, and that was where did the Mexicans where did the country of Mexico really lose Texas? When did it happen? What was the tipping point? And I suggested back then, even though Greg was telling me I was wrong, that it was at Mrs. Powell's Tavern. And Mrs. Powell's Tavern is still a very interesting place. It's where the Mexican High Command got together out by Turkey Creek, close to the county line. Is that right, Greg? Between which two counties?
Fort Bend and Wharton.
Fort Bend and Wharton counties. It's a great archaeological site and a very interesting site, but what Greg told me then and has convinced me of since then is that it was in the aftermath of the meeting of the Mexican officers, the Mexicans who were left over after the Battle of San Jacinto. It's what they stepped into after they left this high command and went back to try to get into a more defensible mode and reestablish contact with the Mexican government. What they stepped into was El Mar de Lodo, the Sea of Mud. And they stepped into it just as one of those 3-day rains came along. It never rains for 3 days in Texas, does it? Houstonians know better than that. And so Greg has been, since I've known him, digging and coming up with interesting and more interesting and even more interesting things in various places. At the Coleto Goliad battleground, on the trail of the Mexican army as described by De La Peña, and described better by De La Peña than the other sources, right? Even though he's a forgery, some say. And now Greg has been involved in this archaeological work at the NRG site. And rather than talk anymore myself, I'd like to have Dr. Dimick, who someday needs an honorary PhD. For any representatives of any universities out there need someone to give an honorary degree to, Arizona State, whoever. I think Greg Dimick is a candidate to be a doctor. Greg, please.
Thank you, Jim, very much. Michael asked me to show you all my T-shirt. This is the pay I've received for hundreds of hours digging San Jacinto. It's got this. On the back is the Guerrero plate that we found in Square 2 on the battleground. Manuel is the one that dug that Guerrero plate, but that's the pay we get for all this hard work. Now he's going to have to get us another one. This says 2003, which is proof that we started this project in 2003. I've been assigned the non-uniform artifacts, and I want to tell you very briefly that I was in Goliad at their Christmas book sale. I was hawking my book, and I got a phone call from Gary Wiggins, and I knew they were out digging that day, and of course I was just sick that I couldn't be there, but I get a call from Gary Wiggins, and he said, "Doc, we're finding stuff. We're finding stuff." I said, "What have you found?" "Bayonets, musket balls, we're finding," and it's like, oh my God, you know, 1.5 miles south of the battlefield. I'm going to show you some of the artifacts we found. I'm going to try not to give it away to anybody. I know the cat's out of the bag now, but I'm still going to try to give you some hints about some of the thought process that was going on. We can skip that. I want to show you a little bit more. I know they have about the conditions, but I want to talk to there are volunteers here that are not too happy with me because I didn't call them to work at this site. But I wanted to show you why we didn't necessarily call you, because it was so limited in space. We're working in these little lanes that the wood gator has gone through, and it was very limited number of metal detectors. Roger and Douglas kept telling me no more than 2 or 3 metal detectors at a time. We can't handle it because each metal detectorist has to have a team. The bottom right picture is a very good-looking crowd you might see in the maroon shirt, which I think is appropriate as an Aggie. The maroon shirt, John Culberson came out there and actually helped us, and he's been learning metal detecting along with the rest of us. And I got to tell you this story. This is part of the process. After they found this site on a Saturday, I have Tuesdays off. I'm old and I can do that. And so they said, "You got to come out here this next Tuesday." And I said, "I'm there." And I was the only one that was signed up to go. Well, they decided that my granddaughter was going to be induced. My my daughter-in-law was going to be induced and my granddaughter was going to be born the same day. But as a pediatrician, I knew that the timing was going to be such I'd have plenty of time to go out there and dig and still make it to the battleground, right? Or back to the delivery. I said, she's not going to deliver till, 3 or 4. Well, I'm on the way. I don't have Roger's number. I'm the only metal detector to be that's supposed to be there that day. So I can't get a hold of him. They called me and said, she's having an emergency C-section right now. Get here. And I told them, well, I've already been to several emergency C-sections. And I've never dug at the NRG retreat site. And I knew I couldn't make it to the emergency C-section on time anyway. So this picture is that day, and I'm holding a bayonet. And it's in my granddaughter's baby book. I got them a copy. Instead of being at the bedside at the delivery, this is my picture for her baby book. And it's appropriate. My wife's nickname is a grandmother, because grandmothers can't be called grandma. She's Dee Dee, and they decided that I was Digger. So I think it's very appropriate. My daughter-in-law has never actively said that she's still mad at me, but I think that's the case. I've learned a little bit about bayonets since we started finding bayonets. These are part of the, I think it's 8 bayonets we found at the site. I was going to tell you the parts of the bayonet. That's the blade on the left. The socket is the upper right, and then there's the stem. I'm blocking on the word. There's another shank. Thank you. And it's rusted, but in the middle of the socket there, where it connects, is the mortise, and that's where it connects. And I found out it's very complicated. I got a book on the British bayonet. I ordered it on eBay, and it's from 1718 to 1783 or something. It's unbelievable how complicated it is. And so it's really tough to figure out exactly what type bayonets these are, but I think we have a pretty good idea. Bayonet size, you can look at these numbers on the left, 20, 15, are the location numbers of the bayonets. So these are bayonets we found. You can see that our length goes all the way from 54.7 down to 18.5. Our socket diameter is generally 2.6. There was no socket on the last bayonet. This is after conservation, this bottom picture is. This is a brown Bess India pattern musket, and that's a good place to start because we knew that primarily the Mexican Army had India pattern brown Bess muskets. So they were made from 1796 to 1819. Their length, if you look there, 55.3 centimeters, and the socket diameter 2.35. So it doesn't seem to match. Going back, it's like, well, we had one that was almost 55 in length, and none of them were 2.35. They're all bigger than that. And I would argue that we have some evidence here that obviously some of this could have just been corrosion. With the links, but most of these links were so short, I think we have evidence that possibly these bayonets would break off and they'd resharpen them. And that's my theory on what's happening with the bayonets. And the sockets even more so, I think for some reason they seem to corrode more. There might have been more wear on them, but I'm suspecting that they corroded more, which of course would make the socket diameter bigger if they're corroded. So we're seeing bigger socket diameters than we should, but I'm still convinced that they're primarily that type. One of the shanks was distinctly different, so we do have a different type of bayonet. I wanted to, we found out as metal detectorists, it's hard for me to say that detectorists, I've always called myself a metal detector, but technically that's the machine. So as metal detectorists, we actually found enough bayonets out there and ramrods on the park. I don't believe we found a ramrod at NRG, but we found that we can start telling the archaeologists we think this is a linear feature. That's our way of telling them, I think this might be a bayonet or a ramrod, and we've actually gotten to where we've been right several times. Which, by the way, that bayonet I was holding up for my granddaughter's baby book, it's interesting, we found that the second day we were out there, and we found it right next to 2 other bayonets that they had found on that Saturday. And I'm convinced that whoever was excavating those, because they're very careful about excavating the bayonets, more like an archaeologist would. They don't use shovels. They use their trowels and do it right. I'm convinced that whoever excavated those two on that Saturday were sitting on the third. And that's why we were able to find that. So I want to thank whoever was sitting on that spot. But you can see what they look like after they've cleared them out. This is actual field work. One of my favorite artifacts, and you've seen it a couple of times, but I don't know if you've paid attention, you notice one of these was 18.5 centimeters. And if you look, is it here today? Did we bring it? Is it in there? They don't even know if they brought it. You can see that we found this the last day, so it's not conserved. But it seems to be a whole bayonet. And we did look up and find that there were pistol bayonets, but we can find nothing that had a socket. We can't find any socket pistol bayonets. Some of you reenactors may be able to educate us. But the socket, unfortunately, is missing, but it certainly looks like it had a connector. Now, the socket isn't there either, so it's like, where would the socket be if they broke it at the time? Throwing out a theory, and I'm not a professional archaeologist, so I can throw out anything I want to. My thought on this is that this bayonet broke so many times they finally couldn't use it for a bayonet anymore, but it still made a nice knife, so they carried it as a weapon. This was the large and the small of it. The next to the last day we were out there, the 4-day deal, it was the next to the last day, I think, or, well, it doesn't matter. But anyway, we found the biggest bayonet, the 54-centimeter bayonet, and within 2 feet of that one, we found the midget. So they were right next to each other. To me, this is fascinating thought about how in the heck did that happen. I'm not even going to throw out an idea there. Bayonet locations. I don't know if you can see it. Is the red the laser? Right in here are 5 bayonets. Over here are 2, the midget and the big one. Over here is another one, and I believe there was even one more out here in the easement. Is that it? That's the one? Okay. But anyway, that's 8 bayonets right there. That was, you can imagine the discussions we had as Mexican Army historians and archaeologists and everything. How in the world would there be 8 bayonets, 5 of them in one group, thrown down on the ground in a line 1.5 miles south of the battlefield? And we started talking about, is this a kill site? Is this a capture site? What the heck is going on here? Roger and Douglas got together and they came up with a theory which they're going to tell you more about. But I want to say that at the same time, and it wasn't me, I don't think I've seen Steve Morgan here. Is he here today? I don't believe he is. He's a dentist, and he's the first one that came to me and said, I know what this is. And he told me the exact same theory that these guys came up with independently. So it's interesting how people can get things figured out. Iron lock plate screw. I happen to have a brown bess musket, so I was able to just take a picture of mine, and you can see this is what we're talking about right here. There are 2 of them right there. This is the side plate, and the lock plate's on the other side. The cartridge boxes. This was another interesting thing that I think gives a lot of credence to the theory, and I doubt that Roger's going to spend much time on this because it's a minor point, but I think it's an important point. Whoops. You can see here they had these 2 buckles right here. I think that's them. I can't hardly see. But there's 2 buckles. Interestingly enough, the Georgia archaeologists that were down working on another project that's ongoing right now, told us that the British used iron buckles in there. And we're not finding iron buckles. What we're finding is brass cartridge box buckles. And you can tell that they're basically handmade and they're very unique. They're not uniform, so these are not mass manufactured. So they're Mexican, and the thing, I'm going to show you in a second, but there's a couple of other buckles. We've got a belt buckle keeper. The brass ring down there, I think, is a scabbard ring, the one over here. We're not sure about this. It might be a pom-pom ring, and this certainly could have come off a sword scabbard. But these are all brass, once again, classic for Mexican Army. Another sling buckle. fairly classic we find a lot of those at our Mexican Army sites. This is an interesting slide, and once again, I hope you can see it. There's two different things identified here. There's buckles. The buckles are the blue, and then the red are the musket ball clusters. Now, I want to try to explain why we would make a slide with musket ball clusters versus the cartridge box buckles. We have good evidence in the documents that the Mexican armies carried paradas of musket balls. That would be a ration of cartridges. We are still unable, and please, if any of you have documentation of how many cartridges the Mexican Army considered a parada or reload, I'm throwing out a number 8, 10, 13. We've seen different clusters of balls, but they would carry them in their cartridge box, probably with a string tied around them. Be very careful when you read De La Peña, because Carmen Perry translated that the Mexican Army was overloaded with ammunition. De La Peña said they were overloaded and they had 8 rounds apiece. Well, that wouldn't have been 8 rounds, it would have been 8 paradas. I went back and looked up the original Spanish. He didn't write rounds, he wrote paradas. So they may have had 80 rounds apiece. That would make a lot more sense that he said they were overloaded with ammunition. But anyway, we're finding these clusters, and it seems to me like what we're finding is where they dropped paradas. And it's interesting also to me that if they're dropping their cartridge boxes, you should find 2 cartridge box buckles for every 2 or 3 paradas of musket balls, and we're not finding that. In fact, we found the buckles basically almost all in the same area, and the dropped musket ball clusters all along this linear formation. Any experts out there know what this is? Gun wrench, there we go. This is a picture that I found on eBay of a 18th century, they called it a common screwdriver, and they said that was very rare at that time to call it a screwdriver. There was something screwing device or something they called it, but they didn't call them screwdrivers. Anyway, it's also got a pick on this end. There's another gun tool that we found. That's got a hammer. I had a harder time finding a good picture of one like this, but there's a hammer, a screwdriver, and a pick. We had some sword hanger buckles. 2 of the 3 of these are Civil War, and one of them's from our site. And I put them on there to show you that things don't change very much. And also there was a big discussion, and I won't get into it, and to be honest with you, I don't know who was on which side, but there was a big discussion among the archaeologists about whether this was a fancy sword, because this was such a lightweight hanger buckle, or whether it was a common one. It generally seems to me like if the Civil War ones are this common dug that look the same basically as ours. By the way, this one's ours. This is the one from our site. And these 2 are both Civil War dug sword hanger buckles that I found on the internet once again. Spur. It's kind of interesting now that we're getting into some horse stuff. Manuel's going to show you some more artifacts, that there was cavalry at this site. We got a spur. This is the only other one of these that I've seen other than the Sea of Mud that we've excavated from a Mexican Army site, which was fascinating to me. We have a lot of these from the Sea of Mud. Of course, they got stuck in the Sea of Mud, and they had 1,200 mules. And so these were probably mule shoes / horseshoes. And so I think we have decent evidence that at least one horse or animal made it this far. Across Boggy Bayou. Of course, there was a lot of documentation that most of them lost their horses trying to cross Boggy Bayou, but I think with a spur and a Mexican horseshoe and some other things we're going to show you, it looks suspicious that the cavalry made it that far. These are the horseshoes that we found in the Sea of Mud, and we found a lot of them. This is actually very, very classic with a Spanish style, the flat and the wide style. I've not heard of these being found in the Republic of Texas sites or the Texas sites. It's very old style Spanish. We found utensils. I'm not sure after you hear the rest of the deal and the rest of our theory, why in the world these would be there, but they are. We're finding some handles. This is a two-pronged fork right there. Whoops, hit the wrong one. Two-pronged fork right here. You can kind of see the prongs right there. But we did find a few utensils there. And we found a real interesting artifact that, once again, we need help with. This is what it looked like the day we found it, and this is after conservation. And I found I spent a lot of time looking, and this is Civil War artifacts. This is a bit chain right here, and these are sword hangers. And they kind of looked like this, but once again, they certainly were not exactly the same. It's fascinating to me that, once again, and it's already been discussed, that lots of times we come up with more questions than we do answers. Here's another really good one. I've looked and looked. I looked for compasses. I looked for lockets. I've looked for several things, and I don't know. This is a brass ring. There's obviously some sort of little wire connector here. And we found 3 little pieces of very flat, old-looking glass in the very same hole. Now, we don't know for sure that they're associated, but they, to me, seem to be. We found at Madam Powell's, when the HAS excavated Madam Powell's, there was a lot of this very flat, which would have been clear glass at the time, but it doesn't weather all that well. So I'm still suspicious about that. I've come up with a list of 5 questions that I want Roger to help answer you. I tried to email this to Roger so he would be aware of this, but I never got it to him. So y'all can, hopefully his talk's going to answer these questions. If not, we'll have the question and answer period. Why the linearity? Why are we finding artifacts in a line? Why do we find so many musket balls, and why are they in clusters? I mean, we found more musket balls here than we did on the battlefield. Twice as many, Douglas tells me. Why so few cartridge box buckles compared to the number of balls? Why so many bayonets in a small area? It's been my impression that one of the big things that the Mexican Army had an advantage over the Texans is they had more bayonets. The bayonets were considered quite a useful weapon. In fact, I've always been told that the India pattern brown bess musket was so inaccurate they considered the bayonet the best part of it. And where are the Texans' artifacts? I think that's all I've got. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Manuel Hinojosa is a man of many accomplishments as architect and artist, as you can see from the cover of your brochure today. I guess in line with the Texas values theme, as a government bureaucrat, there are a number of accomplishments that Manuel has made in his life. But I've found him as a part of myself, as a part of that brotherhood of the Flying Barbecue Sandwich, and digging out into the Mexican retreat, and then in hearing about his work and about his expertise on the Mexican Army, the 19th century Mexican Army, from Greg Dimick. Greg was always telling me what ideas and what finds, and we've heard about one of them already today, that Manuel was able to come up with in his work on this archaeology of Texan and Mexican military history. As you can see, we're sort of moving in a direction with these 5 speakers today. Now that you've heard 3 of them, we're kind of moving in a direction of explanation of what it is that's going on here on the battlefield that the NRG site has enabled them to find. And so Manuel is going to take us another step along the way, and we thank him for coming up from Port Isabel today and speaking to us and enlightening us as to what was happening on the battlefield, the results of which and the evidence of which is only coming to light as we speak. Manuel?
You know, I sat there and I heard Doc complain about this pay, the T-shirt. What he doesn't tell you is that he's always made us follow us. He made us follow him doing these things. So you can imagine what we get out of it. What I'm going to talk about is, the items like the uniforms, the accoutrements, and the buttons that we have recovered at these sites. There seems to be little written about or images that we have available that describe some of these items. A lot of them are personal items, some of them are uniform items, and so when we start to try to analyze them, we find that it becomes very difficult, and sometimes it's hard for us to understand. What this presentation has done is taken other examples and try to make a case to see if we know, and we're speculating too. A lot of the images, a lot of the pictures are only sometimes guesses of what we think they are, and just lead us to some findings where we can share with you some more of a scientific answer to it, because you have been hearing scientific answers. I think my subject's a little bit different in that sense, and so I want to show you examples of findings that we have come across in Mexico, in Texas, and findings along some of these sites like the docks, the Sea of Mud sites, and even some of the other sites that are Texas related. This image right here is another example of how some of these ideas of what the uniforms looked, and it represents the 1829 the Battle of Tampico. This is really the first time that you get an idea of how the Mexican army was trying to shape up, and it's a commission from General Santana by ours by name of Paris. And in here, you start seeing some of the things that we think we're finding at the site, and especially if you can see some of the cavalry and the helmets that really came that existed during this time, but you didn't into the Mexican War, you find them being obsolete. And starting off with the cavalry, and I think that's an area that was mentioned earlier, is that the Mexican cavalry again is only described in some of the information, especially like in Hefter, a document that we follow a lot. But what we do know about the Mexican cavalry, there was three types of cavalry: the heavy, the line, and the light cavalry. And in this case, I'm showing you more of a heavy cavalry that existed during that time. Now, the first company of every unit was really a lancer, so you even have a lancer aspect. What we're not sure of is exactly what kind of cavalry was on this site, and even to the point where we have some items. In this case, you see this socket with a shaft on top that we may think is something that is represented from the top of the helmet, where you have a cropping that's part of the decoration of this cuirassier or type of heavy type of cavalry officer. At the recovery site, what we have also found is this small little object held between the two fingers, the thumb and the finger, and it seems like it could be something very, very decorative that was on top of a helmet. In this case, you're looking at a helmet that was used from the French style during the time 1805, 1850, Napoleon period, and maybe it's part of the socket of a spear that was on top of maybe another half a socket. So again, we would speculate that this little shaft that you see on the top portion of the picture in the bottom, it represents a decoration on this type of a helmet. The examples that we have are not available in the Mexican type of headgear, but at the same time we're finding very interesting items. This looks very pre-colonial, and it seemed like if the units were known to have their own identity, and therefore probably even created some of the gear and equipment that they had. One of the big important finds, and that I have seen at this site, was we found several buttons, and the buttons are marked. The markings on here, as you can see, is a D, dot, and S. Some people said it was an 8, but to our opinion, or my opinion, it represents a D dot S. And in the labeling of the units, a lot of times the dot represented abbreviation. So something like this could be an abbreviation of dragoons. It could be abbreviation. In this case, I don't think it is, of maybe a militia unit from Durango, and even one of the 6 units that was named after battles during the independence of Mexico, which could have been the Dolores, named after the Battle of Dolores, Guanajuato, or what is now Dolores Hidalgo. What's interesting here is that I found a similar button like this in interior Mexico, and it's the only other button that I have seen beside the ones that are found on this site. And these kind of buttons are pewter buttons. They might have been labeled under some of the descriptions of the white metal, which was indicated to be used by cavalry. The soldier, the cavalry, on the left-hand side represents someone, what he might have looked like. Notice that in this case, his headgear doesn't have that socket on top or the heavy type of cavalry, but more of a comb that might have been used. It seems like it might have been used more in the light infantry or even line infantry that existed during that time. Again, this could have been a unit from the Dolores cavalry, which was at the site. Again, it's just a speculation on our part. And just to show you where these 2 different buttons were found, if you look at this here as being San Jacinto, this button was found more than 500 miles away in Paredon on the old Camino Real trail. And so even the examples, they're not, they're far in between. They still tell us a little bit about what the soldier might have looked like. The uniform buttons that were found on the site, besides that, were simple buttons. They were what we call coin buttons. The examples are probably soldiers that did not have any rank, but were mostly just used as a simple, plain, without any identification. Some of them had back markings that indicate to us that might have been imported, but as a whole, the buttons were not labeling any units on the face, and they were mostly made out of brass, except for the one I showed you earlier was more of a pewter button. Other examples like this cluster of buttons shows this is a Mexican battle site that represents the different kinds of buttons that the soldier would use. And I think we have something similar happening at this site. The emblems were common in the Mexican Army. The light infantry, which is represented by this hunting horn that you see on the cartridge box, is represented there by this one right here is represented by a fragment that was found at the site, and you can see that this is the part of the hunting horn that has an attachment. The attachment is at this point. The complete piece it was not there, only it was a partial piece, but it tells us that there was a light infantry at that site. Another example on the battle site was this hunting horn, and even a thin piece of brass that was probably used on a shako, and that we're finding in prior recoveries there at San Jacinto. I want to show you this because I'm going to go into more of emblems, and these are examples of emblems from the past at different locations, different types, different periods. But it just shows you that how a design can change, and there's so many different examples that we have to look at, and sometimes we can't ever tell you what period or even what type of unit are using them. This map represents the area where you have San Jacinto and all the way to Victoria. And it shows the route that Filasola took to Old Fort. But at the same time, it shows you that this type of an emblem, the grenade emblem, which represents more the grenadiers, it could even represent artillery, but it could be used on a cartridge box. It could be used even on a headgear emblem. But this one being found at the recovery site of San Jacinto, recovered at the San Jacinto site, also has been found in other locations along this route. This one right here was found at across the creek at Madame Powell's, and there was even one found in the Sea of Mud. A similar one was even found in Goliad. But they all pretty much were very much alike in the structure and the look. These are cast brass filed type of emblems, and usually made out of a combination of copper, zinc, and tin. And they were mostly made in Mexico. Mexican artisans were very good at doing this, but they also gave a little bit of a character different in different units from each other. We found a lot of fragments, thin roll type stamp fragments, and best we can speculate on these that they were from a shako area, because this was a common material that was used to represent the unit and as far as an emblem. This right here, you can see that when you try to piece it together, it's very hard. The bottom, or this right here, seems to be a central point type of a fragment. We really couldn't tell what that was, only that it seemed like it had some kind of a burst, a sunburst type of effect. And one of the things that was interesting about this is that there's pieces of this look like they've been sheared, forming part of this sunburst or design that was there. But one of the things that you do too is you look at it and say, what else could it be? I brought this picture in to show you something that I found this in eBay, and it shows it was labeled as a portrait of Santana. As I started to look at this, you could see that there's attachment, there's holes on the ends that represent that it was attached probably to a shako, very similar to shakos. And this is not necessarily a frame for a portrait. It looks like a grenade or a flaming bomb, where you have the bomb and also the flames coming up. An interesting thing about this also is it has this eye in the middle of a triangle. And it could have been very, very much personalized, representing the Masonic emblem. But the image that was labeled as Santana could have been an image of Vicente Guerrero, which is one of the units that was at this site. There was the units were in 1833 were named after heroes of Mexican independence, but it just shows of all kinds of things that this could represent, and this is just one example. The infantry units also had emblems, and at this site, the pieces that are shown in over an example We know for sure it is a plate that we had an example of before, not found in the site, but it gives us an idea of what this was. And you can see that this oval design as being a hat plate, and it was attached where the two holes were on each side. The fragments are laid over this piece to show you how they would fit. The actual piece would look like this. And you can see the eagle, and it doesn't necessarily have a snake in its beak, but it does have the words permanente. And at the same time, it has what looks like a G, a G in script, and we believe that represents the Guerrero outfit, one of the units battalions that was at that site. So it gives us more. There's more evidence here to show us that probably this is something that was from a soldier from the Guerrero unit. Other examples were similar to show you that this was a pattern is another generic eagle. This was not found at the site, but it represents a similar type of plate. And as a matter of fact, one of those was found at Goliad. So you can see the units had different markings, and that they were insignias on the shakos. There was a series or a number of brass scales from chin straps found at the site. And you can see that there are fragments, but they represent a chin strap with two holes on the top that would be tied together and scaled as a chin strap for maybe a shako, maybe even a helmet from a cavalry unit. But these examples are represented in other finds that of Mexican Army, and you can see that there's so many different varieties. In this case, we showed 6 different varieties of chin strap scales. There are different shapes, different sizes, even the different number of holes that you attach to. These even have numbers on them to show the sequence of the scales that they and how they're connected. Here's an example of how these scales would have been put together. The shako itself also would have and this is an example of a shako from a Mexican soldier from a different period, really. But it has the leather that the scales were on, and so you could really strap the leather piece, not necessarily the scales. There was, as mentioned earlier, there was some fabric that was found that was wrinkled in with some brass pieces. And I'm just showing you this because it was found, but I will show you other examples that have come up of a Mexican soldier. It could have been a linen type of like a sailcloth that was used, a lienzo that was used in soldier dress, maybe a fine lining. And the example here shows something real similar to that, as well as they mentioned a lot of Querétaro cloth, which was a place where they fabricated many of the uniforms. At this stage of the game, it requires some lab work so we can come back and identify that. Other items on the site, were the buckles, and some of these Dr. Dimmick indicated with some items we don't know what they are, and which are represented right here. And it's just been an accumulation of information that we've been gathering. That's the end of my talk.
To pull all this information together and perhaps to tell us what it means, Roger Moore will speak next. After getting his graduate degrees at Rice University, Roger founded the company that he's still heads, Moore Acheaological Consulting. He's done a great many works, perhaps 500 projects, small and large altogether. And as I said before, his newest area of expertise is conflict archaeology, the kind of battleground archaeology that we've been seeing the evidence for today. Evidence is one thing, a narrative is another. And pulling together, using that historical imagination to make sense out of all of this fragmentary information is what really is at the end of this tale of archaeology and history pulled together. And I'm as anxious as you are to hear what Roger has to say about the project that is coming at least to the end of the first stage. Is that fair enough? Who knows where it's going to go beyond this, but please welcome archaeologist extraordinaire Roger Moore.
Thank you very much. It's certainly a pleasure to be here. We have been working, as you have heard, for quite some time at the broader San Jacinto site, and we've probably come up with some elements of new information as well as a lot of important artifacts from our earlier work. For example, I think we're well on the way to answering questions about the size and the munitions of the used in the Twin Sisters on the basis of the canister base plates. But our being able to work at the NRG site is perhaps the first occasion where we're able really to make an original contribution that parallels the historical record and firms up something that has been known for a long time, but perhaps misplaced, certainly nebulously placed. And we'll move along by addressing the first of Dr. Dimick's questions, and that was, why are these artifacts in a line? This illustrates all the battle-related artifacts recovered from the NRG tract. And you certainly don't have much of a hint of what's going on, of why they're in a line from the modern appearance of the tract, with the tangle of Chinese tallows and other Yopon and so forth that literally made it almost impossible for a metal detector to be used prior to the Woodgator process, which is probably one reason why we found as many material as we did, because it became, within the last 30 or 40 years, it became essentially inaccessible due to the growth of Chinese tallows and other shrubs in what had previously been the edge of an open prairie. This illustrates the alignment along the 1944 USGS topographic map, and that begins to show one of the ways that we're able to use our historical imagination, although we cloak it in terms of hypothesis generation. And I specifically wanted to approach this site, as well as the rest of San Jacinto, first on the basis of the artifacts, what came out of the ground and its distribution and how it relates to its surroundings. So I began to think and discuss kind of apart from but parallel to the historic record, what kind of event could take place that would result in a line of artifacts of this character, one that's about 180 yards wide by only 20 yards deep. And one of the things that comes to mind is that a line of soldiers either in a long file or standing abreast. But then why are they dropping all their military goods at one time in this position? And then again, still taking the environmental and archaeological view of things, we turn to what Jeff discussed earlier, the landscape, the natural landscape. And we find through the GIS process that using of these old maps overlaying in their true geographic position, that the alignment of artifacts is at the edge of a gully, and that the gully was one of the few places with trees in the area. You had trees along Boggy Bayou and along the shoreline, and this smaller gully, which extended to the southwest from Peggy Lake, was also naturally wooded. And of course, I'll end this kind of polite fiction of ignoring the historical artifacts for the sake of cogitating about the historical record for the sake of cogitating about what's there, and admit that at the same time, of course, that we were thinking about, could this be, could a surrender produce these sorts of things, or what kind of other human activity associated with the battle would create a linear alignment of artifacts. We started to look seriously at the historical record to see what kind of event recorded historically might result in the dispersion of artifacts like we see in the field. And we became better and better aware, of course, of the Al Monte surrender of a group of 200 to 400 men that is at some point ambiguously placed. Oh, here's another diagram of individual artifacts, and back to one of Dr. Dimmock's questions, the clusters of musket balls, and I think they are very, very useful in this instance as an indication of individual soldiers dropping multiple bundles of cartridges, perhaps held in fabric bags or something like that, that would not have the buckles that we find are startlingly absent. I'm drawing from Manuel's lecture that we shouldn't certainly expect Mexican Army insignia and so forth to be GI in the American sense, any kind of high degree of standardization. They might be using the same design themes, but there's going to be a lot more hand craftsmanship and variation in the execution of things, ranging from those grenadier badges to cartridge buckles. We find that that the artifacts and the historical record seems to come closest to matching the accounts of the surrender of Juan Al Monte, and I would refer to you to that cover illustrations on your program. I would have included that in the slideshow, but I got distracted by the belated visit from a Chronicle reporter yesterday afternoon and never got around to it, got back to it. You've got to think about the situation that these troops were in at that moment in time. They've escaped the immediate carnage of the battle, and we know that they're fleeing. Some of them are fleeing off to the southeast. We can tell we've got evidence for that in the scattered artifacts that we found along Peggy Lake. But at that point in time, they're still in the stage of being a disorganized, fleeing mob. And they're going to be pursued at some point by the mass of the Texans who are still preoccupied back at Boggy Bayou finishing off a lot of their companions. So the choosing, a good commander always looks at the landscape, and in this case, it's not a landscape of choice. It's a landscape that's dictated by the circumstance of this retreat, and it wasn't chosen in advance. We can agree that it would take a commander with an extraordinary cool head to keep his wits and assert command over a large group of soldiers who had managed to escape the onslaught of the enraged Texans following the slaughter at Boggy Bayou. This hodgepodge of troops was a mixture of Mexican units, and they're making their way across the prairie. But who and what kept them from being ridden down and killed? At least one Mexican officer rose to this challenge late in that fateful day. While we believe that we know his identity, we have abundant and unambiguous physical evidence of his presence of mind and that of all the soldiers who followed his command. Obviously, I'm reverting to my written script since I'm not doing so well as off the cuff. But the resourceful officer recognized a place where the fleeing troops could be concealed long enough for a short respite from Texan pursuit, a pause that was sufficient to impose military discipline and turn the troops' helpless flight into an orderly capitulation. This act of command probably saved most of their lives, since scattered infantrymen in desperate flight have been nothing better than lambs for the slaughter for mounted cavalry since the time of Alexander. The commander managed to gather several hundred troops, organize them into a solid rank about 180 yards wide and at least a couple of soldiers deep, and commanded them to lay down their remaining arms and march out of the cover of the woods as a solid front to the scatter of a few Texas cavalrymen who were poised to attack in the prairie to the southeast. He knew that no matter how strong these Texans' lust for vengeance might be, they would realize that they had no choice but to accept the surrender of such a large and well-organized group. And what accident of topography made that commander's accomplishment possible, or at least much easier? The line of artifacts which we found coincided with the edge of a grove of trees next to a shallow gully appearing on historical maps and aerial photographs. This marks where several hundred Mexican soldiers, sheltered by the trees and organized by Colonel Juan Al Monte, employed discipline to force the Texans to accept a surrender with dignity. This event was noted in the historical record, but was located incorrectly in some accounts, including the memories of the aged Texas veterans who journeyed to mark the actual location of battle events in the 1890s. Some of the variation in the historical accounts are depicted in this map. Of course, there's the marker for the surrender is just on the southeast side of Boggy Bayou, but there's accounts ranging up to this radius around the center of the battlefield. That's 3 miles away from the site of the battle. Whoops. But here we have the red line is about 1.5 miles away, and that depicts the actual distance from the center of the battlefield to, pardon? Blue line. Blue line? Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, blue line with red dots there is the radius to the discovery on the NRG tract, and it's about 1.5 miles from the battle. We've already seen a lot of the artifacts before, but one of the things they bring home to us is that it was a mixture of troops. We probably got some, maybe majority of infantry, some cavalry and so forth, but the officers and non-coms who were present were able to bring together what was a rather disorganized and group of men fleeing piecemeal across an open prairie, where again they could be picked off by cavalry with sabers with ease, and form them up again into a disciplined unit that could achieve a surrender that would not only preserve a little bit of their dignity, but also probably save their lives. So yeah, I think this event was the best possible end to what was otherwise a terrible day for the Mexican army. So, thank you.
We're going to have a few moments for off-the-cuff questions. One thing that should be pointed out for those of you who might not know is that Juan Al Monte was perfectly fluent in English, which I think is fairly important in shouting the desire to surrender at the opportune moment. Al Monte was educated in New Orleans and was fluent in English and French as well as Spanish, and is well known during the Revolution to have used his command of the vernacular English to fool more than one person into thinking that maybe the Mexicans weren't next door but someone else. Do we have any very quick questions before we take our break? Yes, sir.
How deep beneath the surface were you finding these artifacts?
How deep beneath the surface were you finding these artifacts?
Mostly a foot or less.
Are these on? Yeah. Mostly a foot or less. A lot of them were just a matter of several inches. One thing that sometimes limits is the strength of the metal detectors, so we're not guaranteeing that there isn't anything deeper, but we have fairly good metal detectors. I think the deepest things we found were about 30 centimeters, if I'm not mistaken.
And we might add that in the case of the NRG tract, since the archaeology
Roger,
division,
for the sake of the DVD, would you come over here?
and I might add that in the case of the NRG tract, since the Archaeology Division of the Texas Historical Commission, under the direction of Jim Bruseth and Mark Denton, brought their magnetometer to the site, we have a good degree of confirmation that we got all the ferrous, all the iron artifacts out, since we seem to have their results were negative, indicating that we had found everything that was there to find.
One last question before we break. Yes, ma'am, way back in the back. NRG, which I discovered was a sort of a magic way of saying energy, is the name of the company who owns the tract of land and whose executives were given the award at lunch today. And it stands for?
I asked that very question at lunch today, and there are a number of myths and mysteries according to their own PR people. Energy is one. Non-regulated generation was another, and that's somewhat of a inside energy joke. Energy, NRG. Anyway, so I guess it doesn't really stand for anything specific. It's just the company's name.
15 minutes seems like a pretty good amount of time for a break, rather than the 10 minutes that's on your official schedule. We will still get back and start at 4 o'clock. If you want to have any written questions submitted, bring them up here and put them on the podium. And we will, first of all, before you do anything else, let this group know how much you appreciate the hard work they've done. Thank you. And if you, yeah.
Hang on just a second.
They've decided to say something in return.
Something that Dr. Demick pointed out to me I should have done and will now take the opportunity to do. I'd like to ask everyone who volunteered out of either the NRG Project or the other earlier work to please stand up and be acknowledged.
Come on, guys.
What first led you to the NRG site and when? Are there plans to continue further exploration? And I'll save some of the other questions for later, but what led you first to the site?
What led us to the site is what anthropologists would call informants, and what folklorists might call legend. Anyway, the word was brought to us that over the years artifacts related to the battle had been found in that general vicinity. Of course, we had no idea exactly where, and because the tract was so thickly vegetated, we were not at all confident that we could be successful in finding them, especially if they were as scattered as they were along Peggy Lake. But thanks to a combination of luck and a reasonably well-designed sample scheme, we hit that concentration twice and made in our transects, our initial transects, and that made it, everything went from that point upward in the way we feel about it. There probably is some more work to be done to make sure that we followed the concentration out completely. It was mentioned that some of that the high power lines would have interfered with the metal detectors on one edge of the concentration, and we may be able to find some technological fix for that problem to find out whether the material really extends that way. And of course, the deciding factor, there are two deciding factors. One is that we continue to remain in NRG's good graces, and one way to help that happen is for everyone to continue to respect their private property rights by staying off the land, which is fenced and patrolled by the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. And the other way is through continued funding for the overall the archaeology and the overall restoration of the park, which is handled through the Friends of the San Jacinto Battleground Association, the Friends group for the park, and the sponsors of the symposium.
Roger, if you'll stay at the mic, there's a quick follow-up since you spoke directly to the Al Monte surrender hypothesis. One patron asked, where can one find written references to Al Monte's surrender?
I'll let, do you have it?
Sure. We've, as far as where, it's a mixture of sources. I found some in the quarterly of the Texas State Historical Association.
That narrows it down to about 100 years.
I know, it's a volume 4, number 4, April 1901.
That's better.
There was one from the annual publications of the Historical Society of Southern California, of all places, which is, I'm sorry? Just read. Yeah. Have a sentence or two of the. Well, in that case, this one says, Al Monte, finding all was lost and fearing all would be cut to pieces, placed himself at the head of 300 or 400 men, formed them into a column 4 or 8 deep, 4 or 8, I don't know. And threw down their arms, and then held up the white flag and surrendered them at once to a small body of troops who were in pursuit, and they all marched into camp together. So that's one source. R.J. Calder has an account where he talks about Colonel Al Monte's halt, let's see. Just before the sunset, the pursuit and massacre was brought to a sudden stand by Colonel Al Monte's halting the terrified Mexicans in a solid body or column and making a formal surrender. Pedro Delgado has some discussion that led us in the right direction. The Journal of Nicholas Labadie, also Stephen Sparks' account. He's the one who says that Al Monte surrendered 3 miles away from where the battle occurred. Amasa Turner has some surprisingly detailed, if not precisely accurate, distances that he describes as to where the surrender occurred. And then just more recently, I don't have it in this one, but we found a source that said 2 miles. And all of those distances, our site falls within a in-between space between them. So it's multiple sources, and it was just a lot of historical research.
Just a quick follow-up for Sam Haynes. Could you expand briefly on something called the theory of oppression, a term that was used?
I was asked that after my talk, and I haven't had a chance to take a look at that citation. But whoever asked me that question, I'll give you my email after the session here, and I'll send it to you. Okay.
This is a question asked by 2 people. What effect has subsidence had on the investigation and searching for artifacts? I guess that's another way of saying what might be underwater.
I'll go ahead and take that one. The San Jacinto is exactly ground zero for the greatest subsidence in the Houston-Galveston area. Texas Parks and Wildlife, our water folks and our geologists have been studying this for a number of years and have determined that we've lost anywhere between 8 and 10 feet in elevation at San Jacinto. Boggy Bayou itself is probably the biggest evidence of that. Some of the maps that you saw earlier show Boggy Bayou as a very wide landscape feature, which today is simply water-filled. We did a remote sensing study out there, and I've been out on Boggy Bayou myself in a boat with just a long stick. And until 1985, there was a road that went from one side to the other. We found it at a depth of 6 feet with approximately 2.5 feet of silt on top of it. That road was placed there, I believe, in the 30s, and after 50 years, it went underwater, and after another 25 years or so, it is so far underwater that it's got 2.5 feet of more material on top of it. So what is still out there that may be underwater is probably mostly in the Boggy Bayou area. The Texan camp now has levees to keep that area from going underwater. So rather than being underwater, the evidence there may have either been filled over top of by the levee up against Buffalo Bayou, or may even have been cut as the stream widened itself there. Other parts of the battleground itself are high up enough that the battleground proper, the 1,200 acres that Parks and Wildlife manages, that's not going under, although the Peggy Lake area, that entire channel has changed, and Peggy Lake no longer exists. It's now known as the Peggy Lake Fill area. It's essentially a dumping grounds for the Houston Ship Channel. So everything on that side and the marsh along that side, along the San Jacinto, not along Buffalo Bayou, but on the east side, that has either gone underwater or has gone under as much as perhaps 9 feet of fill. What we might or might not have been able to find there would have been the number of soldiers who were killed as they tried to get across those marshes, and as they hit the deeper water and the mud, the Texans were mowing them down, and you can read that in any of the documents. We'll probably never see any of that evidence archaeologically.
Here's a question which I'll try to answer myself. Did General Gaines' soldiers help Sam Houston whip the Mexicans at San Jacinto? And the answer is almost certainly yes, as those who are regular annual attendees to the symposium. I believe Bill and I believe it's Marjorie Walraven. Have I got the name right? Bill and Marjorie Walraven have extensively investigated this and have identified perhaps as many as 200 so-called deserters from the United States Army, many of whom brought their own bayonets across the line from Louisiana to Texas. There were almost certainly United States soldiers, some of whom went back to the United States Army, some of which decided to stay in Texas. And you don't find their bayonets on the battlefield because they lived and kept them. But yes, and the Walravens have written that up in an article, I think about 3 or 4 years ago in the Southwestern Historical Quarterly. But if you'll search the article by the Walravens in the Quarterly, you'll definitely find the answer to that. Here's an interesting question. How does one become an archaeological volunteer?
Well, we've got two sorts of volunteers that have been working with us. The metal detectorists, that awkward term that we coined and imposed on Dr. Dimick and his crew, and people who are avocational archaeologists whose interest can be not more extensive, but broader, because they probably are interested in prehistoric Indian sites as well as historic period sites. And those folks are members of the Texas Archeological Society, which has various chapters around the state, including large ones in Houston and in Fort Bend County. And then more narrowly within the group of avocational archaeologists, there's the members of the Office of the State Archaeologist Archaeological Stewards Network. These are people who have had additional training and are certified by the state to act as kind of agents for the historical commission out in various regions spread all the way all across Texas. When the THC gets calls about something eroding out of a creek or hit by a road construction, they call on the stewards to go out and look at these things and evaluate them because they're on the scene and they can respond quickly. Most of our avocational archaeologists, people have been archaeological stewards or people in similar people in the Houston or Fort Bend archaeological societies. And then Dr. Dimick has coordinated the whole metal detectorist volunteer effort. So defer to him in describing the criteria of that. But of course, one of the basic ones is that they have to work a lot more slowly than they're used to because they have to go along with us picky archaeologists who have to plot in all the finds and dig everything, and which includes, of course, when we're back in the park, an amazing number of tab tops and other pieces of junk and aluminum cans. That was one of the nicest things about working in the NRG tract. It's been private property for so long that there was very little in the way of modern debris there.
One thing I'd like to oh, I'm sorry, Rod. One thing I'd like to point out, even though this may sound a bit elitist, is that because of the nature of this project, when we're on the state lands, we're doing everything under an antiquities permit to Parks and Wildlife or Rogers Company. And the volunteers that we use are all trained. We don't take anybody in who hasn't had any archaeological training. They must know archaeological techniques for a number of reasons, but the most important being that the artifacts that you're seeing here, if they are hit in being taken out of the ground by a shovel, we can destroy them. Understanding the way these machines operate, why the way the metal detectorists, those individual people operating a metal detector operate, the specific information that we are looking for as those objects come out of the ground, that's done through a very specific set of protocols that everybody that works on this project understands. So I don't want to disimbue anybody of trying to become a volunteer, but you do need to go through the training with the Archaeological Stewards Program with the Historical Commission or the Texas Archaeological Society in order to become one of our volunteers. And despite that, the only people up here that are being paid to do that are Roger and Douglas. We have a huge contingent of people who do that, and yet despite the fact that the only two people paid, we have two of the best experts in the world, in Manuel and Greg Dimmick, in these types of artifacts. And that just shows the amount of time and effort that they have personally put into this.
Don't forget that Doug did his work for free, too.
Right, and Dr. Scott, Doug Scott, did his work for free because he's just very interested in it.
But let me say that if you are interested in becoming an archaeological volunteer, the best route to begin that process is through one of the local chapters of the Texas Archaeological Society. Check in your community and see if there is one nearby. And of course, if you live in the Houston area, I've mentioned that there are several in this area.
And the best route to go home if you're leaving here today is not to go down Spur 5 to I-45 because it's now underwater. So you might want to go Elgin or some other route away, but you know how low it gets down there as you turn around and get on 45 from Spur 5 as you leave the University of Houston. You might want to give the water a little time to drain. As Dave Britton reminded me yesterday that I went to school at William Rice's Marsh. And there's a certain flatness to this territory that makes rain a problem. Let me ask the next question of Sam Haynes. This is a question that he addressed to a certain extent when I heard him give a talk recently. Was Mirabeau Bonaparte Lamar for or against the annexation of Texas to the United States?
Well, I'm sure you're referring to the second annexation attempt, not the first. The first annexation attempt he was obviously opposed to. Texas nationalism, as he understood it, was based on this desire to protect, as he said, our peculiar interests, and that meant slavery. And in the 1830s, of course, slavery was under attack in the United States, in the northern states. And in 1845, he was in Georgia, and he came back to Texas, and he had the not only did he campaign for annexation, but he also had the temerity to say that he had been for annexation all along, which made absolutely no sense whatsoever. But his reasoning did make some sense. In 1845, the reason he's for annexation is because he believes that there is now a greater threat to Texas slaveholders. Not only is there a greater threat to Texas slaveholders, but a greater threat to Southern slaveholders. And it's not William Lloyd Garrison, and it's not the Boston, the New England Anti-Slavery Society. It's Great Britain. After the Emancipation Act of 1833, and this fear that Great Britain might actually become, might try to make Texas a client state of the British Empire, this had really given Mirabeau Lamar, like a lot of other Southern slaveholders, like John C. Calhoun, real pause and real grounds for concern. So in both cases, he was opposed to annexation initially because he wanted to protect slavery in Texas, but he supported it in 1845 for the very same reason.
Can I add to that? Lamar also had an ulterior motive because in the claims for the Republic of Texas, he had deferred $10,000 of his salary as president and did not draw it and just left it in the Treasury. And when Sam Houston followed him, refused to authorize the payment to Lamar. So when Texas was annexed to the United States, Lamar was a creditor for his $10,000 as president. He had never yet collected, and they thought that annexation of the United States would give them their best shot at being paid.
Did he get paid? And did he get paid?
You'll have to find the end of the book, and it's like giving you the Harry. It's like giving you the end of Harry Potter.
And I remember Sam reading in one of Lamar's correspondence when he was president of the Texas Republic. He got a letter from the Deep South saying that I hope you'll hold fast to Texas independence so that the southern states can join you when they leave the Union. This was the talk that was going on in the 1830s when late 30s, early 40s when Lamar was president. So it is a mistake always to forget that slavery is very much a part of what's going on in Texas. When the Civil War began, 1 out of every 3 Texans was a slave. Slavery is a very important part of the diplomatic history of the Texas Republic as well as the political history. It's very often in the background and it's not talked about in the textbooks, but you ignore it at your peril. Let me ask another question, which I think is going to be very interesting to everyone here. What will be the final disposition of the artifacts from the NRG site?
NRG has graciously given Texas Parks and Wildlife ownership of those artifacts. I can't say enough about the stewardship of that company. They've been traded a couple of times. They've got new owners, new presence and everything, yet the people that we are working with there are absolutely fabulous and have said, look, this is important. This needs to go to somebody who can steward those artifacts. So my archaeology lab in Austin will have those artifacts. We hope to see them displayed in a visitor center that, as you heard earlier, will be constructed somewhere on the battleground in the next several years. The information, the lessons that we're learning about both the NRG tract and the areas inside the battleground proper are all wrapped up in those artifacts. So that lesson for the teachers bringing their children there and for anybody coming from, pick a state, those artifacts are a main part of that story. So we'll be displaying some of them.
And
I might want to mention the 5 or 6 of the artifacts from the Mexican camp are going to be displayed at the Sam Houston Memorial Museum in Huntsville for the next year. So those are from the previous digs, but they're still very exciting artifacts.
And a very important aspect of getting the information out on the NRG tract, we have both as a professional and really a contractual obligation under the National Park Service Battlefield Protection Grant. We will submit a final report on all the work we've done there. We've already submitted a draft, but it did not include this last phase of the investigation. So we will revise that draft to include the swath area, the major removal of the trees, and the final artifacts that were recovered in that. And that document will be published in a manner specified by the Park Service as part of the grant.
Well, we've been swinging back and forth here between the macro and the micro. Let's go back to the macro again. And I know that this set of 3 questions is by a teacher, if not a professor. Please discuss the following events. I make out tests like that sometimes. And I'll try to take the first one. Sam Houston's maneuver of the Texan Army into the territory between the Neches and the Sabine River. One of our speakers has already referred to Andrew Jackson's peculiar view of the Texas boundary with the United States, or the Mexican-Texan boundary with the United States. There's a really interesting letter that Sam Houston wrote during his retreat to his friends in Nacogdoches. I don't remember if it was to Anna Regay or her father, but he says, remember that Old Hickory claims the Neches as the American boundary. That's west of Nacogdoches. And he says, don't worry about anything happening to you as long as you stay in Nacogdoches. My late friend Tom Lindley, and also my late enemy Tom Lindley, we had a kind of love-hate relationship, as did many of Tom's friends. Tom Lindley found evidence of close correspondence, couriers going back and forth between Sam Houston during his retreat and Fort Jessup on the American side. Couriers, people claiming their bounties not their bounties, but their compensation for going back and forth as couriers between Houston's army. And also there's that curious period of February 1836, where according to most Houston biographers, he's negotiating with the Cherokee. Well, he didn't need to negotiate with them for a month. There's very good evidence that he's in East Texas and in contact with the American Army at Fort Jessup. With regard to the last maneuver, I know some people have alluded already today to the, without mentioning it, to the Whichway Tree, where Sam Houston decides perhaps to follow his army, perhaps not, down towards San Jacinto. Look, Sam Houston didn't decide that day to go to San Jacinto, no matter what Dennis Quaid wanted to dream about in that movie. And most people, many very good historians, have made the mistake of thinking that Sam Houston crossed over at Harrisburg, across Buffalo Bayou, because there are things dated from Harrisburg, but they're on the north side of the bayou. And Sam Houston continued to go east along the north side of the Buffalo Bayou, on the opposite side from where San Jacinto is, from where the battleground now is, until they got word from captured Mexican couriers as to exactly where Santa Anna was. A courier with William Barrett Travis's saddlebags was caught and delivered to Houston, and he knew, because of those letters back and forth between the Mexican army, that Santa Anna was out there with a corporal's guard, a kind of rapid movement to go out and try to catch those Mexican politicians that we heard about today from Jim Bevel. The Texan politicians, Lorenzo de Zavala, David Burnett, the others. It's only when he got that news of where Santa Anna was and how few men he had with him that he ordered the destruction of a farmhouse on the north side of Buffalo Bayou. Now, why? I like to ask audience questions. Why did he destroy that farmhouse?
So it could make a raft out of the floor.
So he could make a raft out of the floor.
Get the artillery across
They had
the line.
They had hardwood floors in that farmhouse, and he took a long time to ferry not only the artillery, those two cannon, but also many of the men across Buffalo Bayou. It was a lengthy operation to cross Buffalo Bayou east of Harrisburg, and in many ways that's when the die was cast, because now he's on the south side. And now he's going to have to meet up with Santa Anna. And now he's making that run to Lynchburg, or at least to Lynch's Ferry. But the critical move, in my opinion, is not which direction they went at the fork of the road between Nacogdoches and down towards Harrisburg. He never went to Harrisburg. He stayed north of the bayou until he found out where Santa Anna's army was, and then he crossed. And that seems to me the critical decision in Sam Houston's campaign, to cross over where, if caught by Santa Anna, he cannot easily cross over again. It's do or die after they cross Buffalo Bayou. Let me ask another question. Obviously, Mexico lost, and I want Greg Dimmick perhaps to address this one. Obviously, Mexico lost the battle against Texas at San Jacinto. What happened to all the cannons, rifles, and other military equipment that the Mexican army had with them?
Well, I don't think it's obvious that the Mexican army lost the Texas Revolution at San Jacinto. You got to read my book, Sea of Mud. There were still 4,000 Mexican soldiers in Texas. The Sea of Mud was another blow to them, but it was obviously a huge strike one against them. San Jacinto was. Most of the stuff that was captured, and there's somebody here that knows more about it than I do, but I'll do a good job of, I think, of summarizing it for him. Joe Hudgens has excavated post-West Bernard with the Houston Archaeological Society, and that was a Republic of Texas gun repair armory type thing, and it was on the West Bernard River in what's now Wharton County, and they were there for a year and a half or 2 years repairing a lot of guns. Most of them seem to be Mexican guns. I believe they set up an armory in Houston, and I don't know whether that was before or after post-West Bernard. But the Texans took those guns, they used them in their army, they repaired them at that armory, they stored them at Houston and at post-West Bernard. They had a cannon there. The one cannon that the Mexican army had there at San Jacinto, it's a good question what happened to that one. There is one document that says that a Texan ship was captured. I don't remember the name of it. I know that William Wharton was on it because he was a captive of the Mexicans in about 1837. There's a document that says on that ship was a bronze cannon that had a plaque on it that said it was captured at San Jacinto. So it's possible that's where the Golden Standard, what happened to it. Talk with Jeff Dunn about whether it was ever called the Golden Standard. There's a lot of doubt about that.
Here's one from Manuel Hinojosa. Is the preserved cloth with copper or cupric residue the remains of uniform filigree? If so, does that indicate the presence or remains of an officer or of an elite soldier like dragoon?
Well, I think that answer to that question is going to be, it's going to come out when some lab investigates it. But my guess on something like that is that the material seems to be a finer cloth, and it evidently had structure in it that probably would come in from more of an elite group. Keep in mind, your infantry soldier was a grunt. He was very simply dressed, and the only ones that would have that fine cloth would have been an officer or a cavalryman, because cavalrymen usually, if you had a horse, you were in the cavalry, and a lot of your horse people were hacienda people. So to answer the question, I think it'd more likely it'd be an elite soldier or officer.
Here's one where I don't know the answer. I don't know if anybody else in the room does, but I ought to know the answer, and I'm not sure. Is Sam Houston known to have visited the Alamo site after the Revolution? Does anyone know? Anyone know if Sam Houston is known to have visited the Alamo site? I simply don't know. I think
that later on, I think his signature, I think on some of the books at the Meeker Hotel. Maybe the 1850s, I don't know. 2036, 1850.
What's the building date of the Minger Hotel?
1850 or so, I guess. I don't know.
I would be very surprised. I would be very surprised if in his career as United States Senator and then later Governor of Texas, he never visited San Antonio again. And if he were in San Antonio, I would be extremely surprised if he did not visit the Alamo site, whether or not he wanted to blow it up. Here's a good question. Can we use the GM63, is that the right term? Can we use the EM63 to find the twin sisters?
I'll try. My best guess would be no. Dr. Everett has used the machine on, he mostly uses it on places where they know something is. It's much harder to use the machine in a purely exploratory mode. So unless we have a really good idea of where the twin sisters are to begin with, at least the general location, I don't know that would be that useful. Best I can do.
Here's one for James K. Polk's biographer. Discuss the following event. James Knox Polk's 1846 American Blood Has Been Shed on American Soil address to Congress.
Discuss it in what way? I'm not sure. What I can say about it, it was clearly disingenuous. I don't think American blood had been spilled on American soil. I think Lincoln was right in asking him to, when he proposed the spot resolution, to name the exact spot where American blood had in fact been shed. I would say that. Polk's position on the boundary is a very interesting one. If you go back and you look at the campaign, when he's campaigning for the presidency, he says on many occasions, because this was an important issue that many Americans realized, that the Mexican claim was a very good one. And compensation for Mexico is something that he is very much in favor of and supports. He is on the record supporting compensation for Mexico in the campaign of 1844. But once he becomes president, then he suddenly changes his mind. Now, why he changes his mind is anybody's guess. But by 1846, in fact, long before that, by 1845, shortly after the inaugural, he is absolutely convinced that the Rio Grande is the legitimate boundary of Texas. He basically takes the Texas view at face value, and no longer is he talking about compensation. Now, he sends Slidell to Mexico to dangle some money in front of Mexican leaders, but he doesn't really believe that they have any right to that, any right to compensation. He is assuming that the Rio Grande has always been the Texas boundary, and therefore is the American boundary after annexation.
Thank you, Sam. By the way, Texas claimed that the Rio Grande was the boundary all the way to its source. Obviously, baloney. This includes Santa Fe, the capital of New Mexico. If Laredo was part of Texas, then so was Santa Fe. That must mean Laredo isn't part of Texas. The Nueces had always been the boundary. Sam Houston had to veto a bill the Texan Congress passed, making the Pacific Ocean the boundary of Texas. So those of you who see the Rio Grande River as the boundary of American soil are simply buying propaganda. It was disputed, but Mexico had the better claim. I think that's fairly obvious.
No, yeah, I think Jim is exactly right. And one of the things that always bothers me in Texas textbooks, history textbooks, and American history textbooks, is that it's such a complicated issue that they just simply say, well, it's a disputed boundary, and they leave it at that. And that doesn't really do it justice, because that sort of assumes that both sides have the equally good claims. And Jim's right, the Mexican claim is much better, in my view.
That is, Texas, not the Mexican claim to Texas, but the Mexican claim to the Texan claims that went beyond Texas. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about the Trans-Nueces and the Upper Rio Grande. That's not part of Texas, never had been. And don't forget that not only did the feds build the San Jacinto Monument, they also drew the boundary for western Texas. Congress did that, the United States Congress, not the Texans. Here's a question. There's a dead silence out there as I speak heresy. What percent of Mexican musket balls were made of lead, and what percent of copper? Were there any copper musket balls found at San Jacinto?
We have not yet found any copper musket balls. Now, the very thought of a copper musket ball may sound strange to some of you, but copper was such an abundant byproduct of the silver mining in Mexico that it was used for unconventional purposes. But the one about which we know the most is for artillery projectiles from the Dr. Dimick's finds at the Sea of Mud, which he can describe in greater detail, and some recent finds for example, the first tiny bit of work for the prairie restoration, where we recovered a copper canister shot within the park.
As far as copper musket balls, we have as far as I know, the only person here that's found copper musket balls, the only one I know of, is Terry Keeler. Terry, stand up for a second. Terry has moved to St. Louis, but he's come back for this. As far as I know, he found 3 or 4 copper musket balls in the Sea of Mud. I don't know why I never found any of them. But we found several hundred musket balls, and we found 3 or 4 copper shot. Interestingly enough, that the United States the Americans were convinced that copper was poisonous and you were evil and vile and just Satan if you used copper shot, because the person was going to die even if it was a minor wound. The Americans were more civilized. They used lead, and that can't hurt you.
Yeah, Herman Ehrenberg's memoir says exactly that, and of course we know that was exactly wrong. But correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Dimick, but there is a reaction, a chemical reaction between blood and copper, which can produce irritation. Irritation, which may make some people think that the copper is poison, but we know that lead is the more deadly of the two.
Yeah.
Here's a question. Was General Koss killed at the Battle of San Jacinto? No, he was not. And he was one of the VIPOWs. Can you figure that one out? Well, along with Santana and Al Monte and others. He's a VIPOW. Manuel Hinojosa talked about a Mexican cavalry helmet. This may have to be the last question. I'm sorry if we can't get to. Oh, let me ask one more because it's important. If we want to contribute to the archaeological work at San Jacinto, sponsored by the Friends of San Jacinto, how do we make out the check? Who do we give it to? Say that again. And should they mark on the check or support archaeological work? Yeah. Did you hear that? Make your check directly to me. No. Make your check to the Friends of the San Jacinto Battleground and indicate in the detail line that it is to support archaeological work. And then the last question, I'm afraid, is for Manuel Hinojosa. In speaking to the Mexican cavalry helmets, you suggested that the style dates from colonial times. What era do you mean by colonial times?
Well, I said the socket looked very colonial. That leads me to believe that it was something that was a little bit earlier. Keep in mind a lot of the helmet style is very much of a neoclassical, what they call a Miramar type of design that was used by the French soldiers during Napoleon times. And there was 4 styles between 1905 and 1950, and after Waterloo, of course, that didn't exist. It seemed, I would think that Mexico adopted that helmet and used it till 39 when it was made obsolete. Mexico also, what they would do is they would enlist foreign officers to help them design and put together this uniform that was being used. One of the ones that comes to my mind, Carlo Beniski, was an early Iturbide officer that was with General Santana for most of the time, and he had a lot to do with shaping the cavalry into what was in 1836. So it only happens that anything before 1821 is colonial. And I would say that a lot of the colonial designs were sort of were incorporated and were just something that continued on for years afterwards.
Greg Dimick has to leave immediately. He's got to be in a play tonight, and there's a flood between him and the play. And so not only for Greg, but for all of the people, all of our speakers today, would you please give them one more token of your appreciation?